An abandoned dog meets a lone and blind elderly man on the street, and then a tragedy happens, leaving everyone horrorized. Loneliness can be a difficult weight to bear. Sometimes it settles in slowly, almost silently, until suddenly we realize that there is no one else around us. For Mr. Antonio, loneliness was not just a feeling, it was his daily reality. Since he lost his sight, his world had become a small and restricted place, delimited by the walls of his house and the careful touch of his hands on the weathered furniture. Every step was measured, every movement planned. There was no room for surprises, for unforeseen events, for life happening outside. The house that had once been full of laughter, voices, and visitors was now just a silent shelter. Time seemed to have frozen in there. The furniture was in exactly the same place it had always been, not by choice, but by necessity. Antonio needed to know where everything was to avoid falling, to have a false sense of control over a world he could no longer see. The memories were everywhere, but there was no one left to share them. The seat next to yours remained empty, and the radio that used to play old music now only emitted static noises. Outside, the world continued to spin. Children played in the streets. Neighbors greeted each other, cars rushed by, but none of that made any difference to Antonio. He no longer saw the seasons change. He didn't see the sky change color in the late afternoon. He didn't see the stars shine in the darkness of the night. All that was left was the voice of the clock telling the time, the distant sound of the wind rustling the trees, and the echo of his own thoughts. Time, once so precious, now seemed like a burden. The days were long, stretched out by endless hours of waiting. But wait for what? He didn't know. Maybe for a visit that never arrived, for a call that never came, for a memory that brought some comfort. The truth was that he no longer expected anything. The world had forgotten him, and in a way he had forgotten the world too. The mornings were all the same. Antonio always woke up at the same time, felt around the bedside table in search of his talking clock, listened to the time, and without rushing, got out of bed. The coffee was prepared automatically. The strong smell of the hot liquid filled the kitchen, but it no longer brought him pleasure. Meals were solitary, the dishes always placed in the same place so that he wouldn't spill anything. Sometimes he wondered if he would miss seeing his own image in the mirror, but after so many years, even the memory of his own face seemed faded in his mind. Leave the house? This idea was no longer part of his reality, not because I didn't want to, but because it was risky. The streets were unpredictable, the steps treacherous, and relying on others to help him was something he avoided at all costs. I had already felt the frustration of being treated impatiently, of being a burden to others. So, he preferred isolation. Silence was better than humiliation, but even if he didn't admit it, there was something inside him that still yearned for a change, for a sign that life wasn't over for him yet. Something that said that, even in the dark, there was still something waiting for him. And on that cold night, when an unexpected sound echoed through the front door, Antonio didn't know it, but everything was about to change. Silence can be deafening. Antonio was already used to it, but on that cold night, something broke the monotony. At first he thought it was a figment of his imagination, some distant noise that the wind carried aimlessly. But the sound returned, more insistent this time. A low cry, almost a whine, coming from the door of your house. His heart quickened, not from fear but from strangeness. No one had visited him in years. Who would be there at that time? He remained motionless for a few moments, listening. The sound was irregular, weak, but it carried something he recognized very well: loneliness. A loneliness that echoed within him, that was part of his routine, of his existence. He took a deep breath and with difficulty stood up. His movements were calculated, his steps slow and careful. Every inch of the house was memorized, every obstacle previously known. I didn't need to see to know exactly how to get to the door. As he approached, he felt the cold air escape through the crack, a stark contrast to the stuffy heat of the house that was no longer a home, just a lifeless refuge. His hand found the cold doorknob, and for a second he hesitated. Something inside him told him that when he opened that door, something would change. Whatever was out there was not part of his closed, predictable world. When the door finally creaked open, the icy wind came in all at once, sharp as a blade, and with it came the smell of snow, night, and something else. Before he could try to understand, he felt something touch his leg, a light but tremulous touch. He couldn't see it, but the cold of it was evident, penetrating. He hesitated, trying to decipher the sensation, until the answer came in the form of a small, heaving sigh. A dog. He couldn't see her eyes, but he felt her presence clearly. The bristly fur, wet from the calm of the night, the constant tremor that made his small body vibrate. The animal placed its nose against the thick fabric of Antonio's pants and remained there, motionless, as if asking permission to stay, as if it had nowhere else to go. Antonio lowered himself slowly, not knowing exactly what he was doing. It was strange. It had been years since anyone had touched him, years since he felt a presence other than his own inside that house. But there was that little being, trembling, vulnerable, surrendered. With his fingertips, he touched the dog's fur, and what he found made something inside him shudder. It was cold, so cold it felt like stone. And yet, he still breathed. He still resisted. The dog did not move away from the touch. On the contrary, she seemed to snuggle against him, as if that simple gesture was more than she had received in a long time. Antonio felt the cold nose brush against his hand, and without thinking, he slid his fingers over the animal's thin neck. There he felt a bone protruding too much, a thinness that betrayed hunger and carelessness. Why was that dog there? Where had it come from? He didn't know the answers, but a certainty grew within him. The dog was alone, abandoned, just like him. For a long moment, the two remained there, as if they were both trying to understand the situation, as if they were wondering if that meeting was really happening. Antonio didn't see it, but he felt it, and I felt something different that time, something new, a strange heat that spread across his chest, an unexpected desire not to close that door and pretend nothing had happened. He took a deep breath and made his decision. Still kneeling, he passed his hand over the small, trembling body and made a gentle movement, a silent invitation. The dog didn't hesitate. He knew. With uncertain steps, he crossed the threshold and entered the house. The door closed behind them, sealing a moment that Antonio could never have predicted. An unexpected meeting between two lonely souls, two hearts that had been left behind, two beings who had never seen each other before, but who, in that instant, knew they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Animals speak with gestures, looks, and acts of pure love. Antonio almost gave up, but Nick showed that a simple meeting can change everything. Have you ever felt like an animal was trying to tell you something? Comment here. Stories like this need to be heard. So subscribe now and leave a like so that more people understand the power of love and loyalty. Some connections happen so naturally that they seem to have been written by destiny. Antonio never imagined that his life, immersed in solitude for so long, would change with something as simple as the presence of a dog. But Nick, that little being who appeared on her doorstep one cold night, wasn't just a temporary visitor. He never left. The first few days were of adaptation. Antonio, accustomed to a silent and predictable routine, now had a new element in his daily life. The sound of Nick's paws echoed across the wooden floor. His sighs and movements could be heard as he settled down to sleep in some corner of the house. The elderly man noticed his presence, even in the way the air seemed different, as if the space around him had filled with something he didn't even know he missed. Nick was cautious at first. He slept near the door, as if he wasn't sure if he could stay. Perhaps he expected to be expelled at any moment, as must have happened so many times in his life as a street dog. But little by little, he got closer. On the first morning, when Antonio woke up and sat on the edge of the bed, he felt a cold nose lightly touch his hand. It was a small gesture, but it made something inside him feel warm. Antonio still didn't fully understand the presence of that dog, but he knew one thing: he was no longer alone. For the first time in many years, there was someone waiting for him when he got up, someone who breathed beside him while he drank coffee, someone who huddled close to his chair while he spent hours in silence. Little by little, Nick began to show his personality. He wasn't pushy. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't bark, without reason, and seemed to have a keen instinct for understanding Antonio. If the elderly man moved around the house, Nick accompanied him without interfering, always attentive, always close enough to let him know he wasn't alone. When Antonio sat on the porch to feel the cold afternoon wind, the dog lay down next to him, observing the world that his owner could no longer see. And then, something curious happened. Antonio, who had not felt the need to speak for years, it was just a whisper, a comment in the air. "Are you hungry, boy?" he asked without even waiting for an answer, just out of habit. But to his surprise, Nick reacted. It raised its ears, tilted its head slightly, and tapped its tail on the ground. That was the first sign that something different was happening. Over time, the conversations became longer. Antonio talked about the past, about the memories he kept only for himself. He talked about the times when he could see, about how he used to walk those streets without fear, about how time seemed to pass differently now. Nick listened to everything in silence, but his presence was more than enough for the elderly man to feel like he was being heard. One day, as he was running his hand through Nick's fur, he felt a small cut healing near the dog's ear. He stopped, his fingers tracing the scar, imagining how many battles that little animal had already faced alone, how many nights sleeping in the open, how many rejections, how many closed doors. He felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't need to see it to understand that Nick carried a story with him, a story that for some reason destiny crossed with yours. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe it was just chance, but deep down, Antonio felt that he wasn't. Nick didn't appear there by chance. He arrived because he knew that was where he was supposed to be. And for the first time in years, Antonio felt like he had a reason to look forward to the next day. Antonio's routine had become predictable. After years of living alone, every step was calculated, every movement rehearsed in a silent choreography inside his own home. He knew every corner, every unevenness in the floor, every piece of furniture positioned precisely to avoid accidents. But that morning, something got out of control. The day started like any other. The smell of fresh coffee filled the small kitchen, and Antonio, with his usual patience, moved slowly, guided by the senses that, over the years, had become his true eyes. Nick, as always, was by her side. It didn't matter where the elderly man went. The dog followed each step, sometimes attentive, sometimes just lying down and watching. But that day, something different happened. Antonio got up from the chair and headed towards the kitchen. He leaned against the wall, feeling the familiar texture under his fingers, as he always did. But all it took was one slip, one simple mistake, and his foot found the folded rug. In a second, he lost his balance. The body leaned forward, and before he could grab anything, he felt the impact. The icy ground met his back hard, and a moan escaped his mouth. Pain shot through his leg, intense, sharp. He tried to move, but an uncomfortable weight was holding him back. His breathing became labored. Panic settled in his chest overwhelmingly. Alone. He was always alone. For years, he learned to accept the weight of this constant silence, to live with the absence of voices, of touches, of any presence. That broke the monotony of his days. But now that reality seemed scarier than ever. The cold ground beneath his back, the throbbing pain radiating from his leg, and the cruel knowledge that there was no one to help him created a despair he hadn't felt in a long time. What would you do? How would you get up? With each attempt to move, the body protested. His arms shook under his own weight. His hands slipped on the smooth floor. The fear grew, more suffocating than the pain, heavier than the body he couldn't lift. Time seemed to drag by. He took a deep breath, trying to catch his breath, but every second of stillness made his despair grow even more. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his heart racing with fear of being there, trapped, with no one to listen to him, with no one to help him. It wasn't just a fall. It was a cruel reminder of her fragility, of how illusory her independence was, of how a simple stumble could turn her home into a prison. It was then that something unexpected happened. Nick, who had previously only followed him with silent loyalty, moved quickly. The sound of paws skimming the floor echoed through the house. Antonio felt something warm and soft press against him, a different, comforting weight, as if the dog's presence suddenly filled the emptiness around him. In the midst of pain and despair, he realized, Nick wasn't just by her side, he was trying to help him. The dog's movements were not random. Nick didn't jump on him, didn't circle him in uncontrolled excitement. He was firm, positioned precisely next to Antonio's fallen body. The dog pushed against him, adjusting his weight, offering support. The heat of the animal contrasted with the cold of the ground, and Antonio, still stunned, took a few seconds to understand what that meant. Nick Sabia. It wasn't just any instinct. It wasn't just a random reaction. There was intent in his movements. There was understanding. The dog didn't hesitate. didn't wait for a command. He simply acted because he understood even before Antonio did that he needed help. Instinctively, the elderly man's fingers moved, feeling Nick's dense, warm fur, seeking firmness. He felt the dog hold still, allowing his hands to find a foothold. The animal's muscles were tense, as if it knew exactly what it was doing, as if it was prepared to support part of Antonio's weight. With a painful effort, he tried to rise. The body resisted at first. The arms shook, the injured leg protested. But Nick remained there, firm, resistant. The dog adjusted its position, slightly changing its weight to offer more balance, as if it were guiding Antonio without needing words. And then, with one last push, the elderly man managed to sit down in the chair. His heart was still racing, the pain persisted, but something inside him had changed. He was not alone. Nick wasn't just a dog that showed up at your door one cold night. He was there for a reason. And at that moment, Antonio realized that his life would never be the same. Trust is something that is built in silence, in small everyday gestures, in the comfort of a presence that demands nothing, but is there. Antonio had already become accustomed to depending only on himself, to relying only on the memory of the spaces he knew and the rehearsed movements that made his life predictable. He had no alternative. Your vision has been gone for years, and with it, the freedom to explore the world without fear. But now, something different was happening. For the first time in a long time, Antonio felt that I wasn't alone. Since the day Nick helped him get up after his fall, a silent connection had been established between them. Before, the dog was just an unexpected companion, someone who showed up at your door one cold night and who, for some reason, decided to stay. Now he was much more than that. Antonio began to notice small details, subtleties that might have gone unnoticed before, but that now made all the difference. Nick never just walked around the house. He always accompanied Antonio. It didn't matter if the elderly man was just going to the kitchen or to the chair on the porch. The dog was always there, silent, attentive. At first, Antonio thought it was just instinct, perhaps a remnant of the difficult life the little dog had led before appearing on his doorstep, a habit of following those who show affection. But it wasn't just that. Nick knew what he was doing. Antonio realized this when, one morning, he walked slowly down the corridor that led to the backyard. As always, he felt the walls with his fingertips, mentally counting the steps to where he should stop. But that day, something was different. Just as he was about to take another step forward, he felt a slight push against his leg. He stopped, surprised. He frowned, trying to understand what had happened. Nick had pressed his body against him. Instinctively, Antonio stretched his hand forward and encountered an unexpected obstacle. The door I used to leave open was closed. If he had kept walking, he would have hit her hard. He stood there for a few seconds, his breathing slow, his heart racing, not from surprise, but from realization. Nick stopped him from getting hurt. It was a small gesture, but full of meaning. The dog not only accompanied him, he took care of him. From that day on, Antonio began to notice other things. Whenever he walked through the yard, Nick stayed close, paying attention to every movement. If there was something in the way, an exposed root, a rock out of place, he stopped first. Sometimes, when Antonio insisted on following, he felt a slight push from Nick's nose on his leg, as if the dog wanted to say, "Wait, there's something there." And Nick was never wrong. Over time, Antonio began to trust, first hesitantly, then almost naturally. He no longer felt the need to feel the walls so often inside the house. Nick was always close, ready to guide him subtly, without him needing to ask. It was as if the dog had understood something that Antonio himself took time to accept. He needed help, and Nick was there for it. Walks around the yard got longer. After so much time confined to the same few meters inside the house, Antonio felt, for the first time, the desire to go beyond. And when he finally took one more step, when he dared to step over the backyard gate and onto the sidewalk for the first time in years, Nick was there, by your side. It was a small moment, but huge at the same time. The cold morning wind touched his face, and for a moment he felt afraid. But then he also felt the collar firmly in his hand, the dog's warm body brushing gently against his leg, the gentle tug Nick gave to guide him forward. He took a deep breath and followed. Every step I took was an achievement, a battle against years of isolation, against the fear of making mistakes, of falling, of needing others. But with Nick, I didn't need to ask for anything. The dog just knew what to do. The first walk down the street was short, but meaningful. After that day, Antonio began to feel safer to try again. Short journeys, always guided by the dog, who, incredibly, seemed to see for him. Little by little, Antonio began to notice something that made him smile discreetly, something that made his chest feel warm in a way he thought he would never feel again. Nick wasn't just seeing for him. Nick was giving him back the world he had lost, and that, he knew, was just the first of many journeys to come. Antonio's life had always been a predictable sequence of days that repeated themselves without variation. Dawn brought few changes, and night fell on a house that no longer saw anyone entering or leaving. But since Nick appeared, something started to change. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible, small moments that to anyone else might seem insignificant, but to him were gigantic. Nick's mere presence made everything different. Antonio knew that, at any moment, if he reached out his hand, he would feel the warmth of the dog's soft fur. He knew that when he got up, he would hear the faint sound of paws following his steps. Small certainties that, without him realizing it, began to rebuild something inside him. A sensation long forgotten. Security. And that's how the monotonous routine began to give way to something new. Before, Antonio didn't leave the house. Not because I didn't want to, but because fear spoke louder. He had accepted that the outside world was dangerous, unpredictable territory, a place where he was vulnerable. But now there was Nick, and Nick didn't allow him to feel alone. The dog always guided him inside the house, preventing him from tripping over furniture or bumping into open doors. In the backyard, Nick remained alert, preventing Antonio from moving into places where he could get hurt. That's when he started to wonder, what if Nick could guide him beyond the gates? The idea scared him at first. What would happen if something went wrong? What if he fell? What if Nick got distracted? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I already trusted the cub in a way I'd never trusted anyone else in years. And so, for the first time in a long time, he decided to try. On the first day, Antonio took a piece of rope he had saved and carefully tied it to Nick's collar. His fingers trembled a little, but not from fear, from anticipation. It was the first time in years that he was preparing to leave. Without someone holding his arm, Nick stood still as he finished tying the rope, as if he knew exactly what was happening. When Antonio held the tip of the improvised guide and took a deep breath, he felt a slight pull, gentle, careful. Nick was ready. The first journey was short, just a few steps beyond the gate. Antonio felt the wind on his face, something so simple, but he hadn't experienced it in this way for so long. He felt the heat of the sun touching his skin, the uneven texture of the ground beneath his shoes. But the most important thing was what he didn't feel: fear. Nick walked ahead of him, but always attentive. If there was an unevenness in the ground, the dog would stop and adjust the route. If a hole appeared in the path, Nick avoided it with precision, leading Antonio without him even realizing the danger there. And at that moment, something inside the elderly man lit up. This wasn't just a walk, it was freedom. In the following days, journeys increased. First to the corner, then to the other sidewalk. Antonio learned to feel Nick's subtle movements. A slight tug indicated that he should follow. A firm block was a signal to stop. The two understood each other without words, without the need for commands. It was as if Nick had always been born for this. And the more Antonio walked, the more he felt something he thought he would never experience again: trust. People started to notice. Before, he was just the elderly man who never left the house. Now, he was the man who walked every morning alongside a faithful dog. Some neighbors greeted him, some stopped to ask about Nick, and Antonio, without realizing it, started to smile more. The feeling of the wind, the heat of the sun, the sounds of the street, everything seemed new and at the same time familiar. He realized that the world outside never ceased to exist for him, but he had ceased to exist to the world. And now, with Nick by his side, he was returning. Every walk was a reminder that he was still capable. May your life hadn't finished just because your vision is gone, that there was still a lot to feel, explore, and live. And all this because a dog, who appeared at his door one cold night, decided that she would never leave him alone again. Trust is something that is built little by little, brick by brick, gesture by gesture. And between Antonio and Nick, this trust had already become something unshakable, Since the dog started guiding him, the elderly man's days had completely changed. Walking around the neighborhood was no longer an impossible challenge. The fear of tripping, falling, or getting lost had been replaced by the security of knowing that Nick was always there, paying attention to every step. The world, which was once just a distant echo beyond the walls of his home, now became part of his life again. He could smell the smells of the street, the wind rustling the leaves of the trees, hear the voices of people talking in the distance. Antonio didn't need to see it to know that the day was beautiful or that a storm was approaching. Nick, with his instinctive intelligence, showed all of this to him in ways no other human being could. And it was like that, with a light heart and a newfound confidence, that Antonio went out for another walk that afternoon, without imagining that in just a few seconds, the life he was beginning to recover would almost not be taken from him. The path was the same as usual. They left Antonio's house, passed through the small gate and followed the sidewalk. Nick walked beside him, the leash loose between the elderly man's fingers, which he no longer needed to hold so tightly. He had already learned to interpret the dog's every movement. If he accelerated, Antonio knew the path was clear. If he slowed down, it was because an obstacle was approaching. The routine was always calm. They walked to the corner, waited patiently for the beep that indicated they could cross the street, and then continued on. But that day, something different happened. Nick stopped abruptly. Antonio felt the tug of the collar and frowned. The dog never interrupted the walk like that. Normally, if something blocked the path, he would just adjust the route, guiding the elderly person along another route. But this time, he stopped. "What's wrong, boy?" asked Antonio, confused. He reached out toward Nick and felt the dog's body stiffen. Nick was tense. His breathing was heavy, different. Then, Antonio heard something he had never heard before. One low growl, almost like a warning. Nick never growled, never. He was a calm dog, attentive but never reactive. The sound sent a shiver up the elderly man's spine. Antonio didn't know what was happening, but he trusted Nick. If he was letting you know something wasn't right, then something wasn't right. It all happened very quickly. Before Antonio could react, Nick advanced forward and with a firm movement pulled hard on the collar. Antonio felt his body being pulled back, and at the same moment, a noise cut through the air. The screeching sound of tires screeching on the asphalt. A car sped right in front of them, completely ignoring the red light. The wind caused by the speeding vehicle ruffled Antonio's hair and made his skin crawl. It was a matter of seconds. If Nick hadn't stopped, if Nick hadn't growled, if Nick hadn't pulled Antonio back with force, he would have been run over. Shock took over him. His heart raced, his fingers tightened on the collar so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to understand what had just happened. It was only then that he realized. Nick was panting but still alert. You knew. I knew that car wouldn't stop. He knew that Antonio would not be able to react in time. That's why he saved your life. The elderly man was speechless. All he could do was slowly kneel down and run his hands through Nick's warm fur, feeling the dog's heart still racing. Antonio couldn't see their eyes, but he knew what they were saying. "I am here." Antonio's hands were still shaking when he held the dog's face and whispered in a choked voice, "You saved me, boy." Nick, as if he understood exactly what those words meant, just snuggled against him. The elderly man has never felt so safe in his life. He had already lost his vision, he had already lost his freedom, he had already lost trust in the world. But Nick brought it all back. And now, Nick had given you something even greater, life itself. Antonio's routine, which was previously invisible to the eyes of the world, began to become something impossible to ignore. For years, he was just a lonely man, locked in his house, rarely walking around the yard like a prisoner who has grown accustomed to his own bars. Few knew his name. Even fewer knew its history. For many, he was nothing more than a vague memory, someone who once walked the streets, but who, over time, disappeared amid the city's routine. But then something changed. Nick, the dog that appeared like a miracle on his doorstep, began to transform him from the inside out. First, giving Antonio his courage back. Then, your sense of direction. And now, without the elderly man noticing, Nick was giving him back his presence in the world. At first, the changes were subtle. Neighbors noticed Antonio walking more frequently. Before, they rarely saw him, always hesitant, with uncertain steps, as if he were testing the ground. Now they saw a man walking with his head held high, guided by a dog that seemed to know every step of the way. But it was after the day Nick saved Antonio from being run over that people's views began to change. It wasn't just a dog accompanying an elderly person. It wasn't just a dog that was loyal to its owner. Nick was different. The first to comment on this was the baker on the corner. Antonio passed by there every morning, guided by Nick, and the man watched the way the dog moved. It wasn't just a companion dog. He stopped before obstacles, waiting for the best moment to cross, blocked Antonio's passage if he noticed something wrong. "This dog," he murmured one day, watching Nick lead Antonio back home. "He sees for him." The words spread quickly. The story of the dog that seemed to have a gift for guiding a blind man began to circulate around the neighborhood. At first, people just commented among themselves. Some watched from a distance. But little by little, the silence was broken. First, it was a lady who lived on the street behind. She approached timidly when she saw Antonio sitting in the square, with Nick lying next to him. "He's incredible, Mr. Antonio," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I've never seen anything like it. He really knows what he's doing, doesn't he?" Antonio smiled. "He knows. He always knows." The next day, the same lady appeared with a bowl of food. He didn't say anything, just placed the food next to Nick and gave Antonio a smile. The dog wagged its tail, and the elderly man, for the first time in a long time, felt that he was not invisible. After that, other people started to approach. The boy at the pharmacy, who until then had only known Antonio from afar, started asking if he needed anything. "If you need medicine, I can bring it to your house, okay?" The market owner started separating small packages of cookies for Nick and handing them out whenever Antonio passed by. It was like suddenly he had come back into existence for those people. And with each new display of affection, Antonio realized that Nick was changing not just his life, but the way the world saw him. Before, he was just a forgotten old man. Now he was the man who walked with Nick, the dog who saw for him. And that, in the end, made all the difference. Antonio's routine had changed so much in the last few months that if someone had told him a year ago that he would be walking the streets alone, relying entirely on a dog to guide him, he would have found it impossible. But now this was his reality, and for the first time in a long time, he felt part of the world again. Nick was no longer just a companion. He was her eyes, her support, her security. Since appearing at his door on a cold night, the dog has, little by little, given back to Antonio everything that life had taken from him. His confidence, his courage, the feeling that he could still live fully. And the most impressive thing was that no one had taught Nick how to do that. He simply knew. But Antonio had never stopped to think about what that really meant. He had never heard of guide dogs. "I never knew there were dogs trained to help blind people like him." For him, everything Nick did was just proof of his loyalty, of his unconditional love. Until, one peaceful morning, something unexpected happened. The sound was so unexpected that Antonio took a few seconds to react. A knock on the door. It wasn't something common. The only times the silence in his house was interrupted by a sound like that, it was usually by mistake. Delivery men knocking on the wrong door. Children playing in the street without knowing someone lived there. But that beat was firm, determined. Nick, who was lying next to the armchair, raised his head and gave a small bark, as if he was also surprised. Antonio frowned and stood up carefully, feeling the presence of the dog immediately at his side. "Let's see who it is, boy." He slid his hands along the wall, guiding himself to the door while Nick followed him, paying attention to his every movement. When he turned the handle and opened it, he felt the cold morning wind invade the house. But what surprised him most was the unfamiliar voice that came right after. "Good morning, Mr. Antonio. Sorry to bother you. My name is Raphael. I work at a training center for guide dogs." Antonio remained motionless for a moment. "Guide dogs?" The word sounded strange in his ears. "I think you must be mistaken," he said with a hesitant tone. The person in front of him let out a small, polite laugh. "Actually, I'm not. I heard about your dog. Neighbors comment on him. About how he guides you through the streets, about how he stops before obstacles, about how he seems to foresee dangers before they happen." Antonio felt Nick move subtly beside him, as if he was assessing the situation. He reached down and ran his fingers through the dog's warm fur, feeling his calm breathing. Yes, Nick always did that from the beginning. But he wasn't trained for that. Antonio paused, looking for the right words. He just knows. That's exactly what impresses me, Mr. Antonio, said Raphael. Guide dogs go through months of training to learn to do exactly what Nick does instinctively. Did you know that there are programs to teach dogs to help blind people? Antonio was silent for a moment. I did not know. I never knew. Since losing his sight, he just accepted that his life would be like this, limited, full of fears, confined within familiar walls. No one ever told him about dogs that could guide him, about the possibility of walking the streets safely, about the chance of return to living without fear. But then he realized something. Nick didn't need training. It was already your guide. And for the first time, Antonio understood the greatness of what that dog had really done for him. Nick wasn't just a friend. He was sent to change your life. Time has a curious way of reminding us of its passing. He doesn't warn, doesn't knock on the door, doesn't ask for permission. It just moves on, taking with it pieces of us that we don't always realize are leaving. Antonio was never afraid of time. He had already accepted his marks, his pains, his silences. But over the past few months, something inside him has begun to change. Before Nick, he didn't think about the future. The future was just an endless repetition of the present, a sequence of days without much change. But now everything was different. Every day with Nick was a gift. Every walk, every touch of the wind on his face, every excited bark at dawn reminded Antonio that he was still alive. But with that also came an inevitable thought. And when he was no longer there? The first time this doubt arose, he tried to push it away, but it was like a persistent shadow, always present in the quiet moments. Antonio felt that his body was no longer the same. His steps were a little slower. His bones seemed to protest more against the morning cold, and tiredness arrived faster than before. He was not naive. He knew that time was a companion, that one day he would move forward without him. And what would happen to Nick? The thought of his faithful friend wandering aimlessly without a home, without someone to guide him as he guided him now, tightened his chest in a way he couldn't ignore. Nick saved him so many times. It gave him back his freedom, his purpose, his desire to live. He couldn't just leave him without a destination. It was then that he made a decision. The thought had been following him for days, silent, insistent, growing with each new morning when he woke up and felt his body a little heavier, his movements a little slower. Antonio was never afraid of time, but now he felt it shortening, moving forward, and with that came the certainty that he could no longer postpone that moment. That morning when Raphael, the man from the guide dog center, came back to visit, Antonio knew he needed to talk. The weight of what he was about to say tightened his chest, but he took a deep breath and kept his voice steady. I want Nick to continue helping someone, even when I can't be here anymore. The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Raphael took a few seconds to respond, and Antonio didn't need to see his face to know that the boy was choosing his words well. He understood the weight of that sentence. It wasn't just a request. It was an early farewell, a preparation for an inevitable moment. Do you want Nick to become a guide dog? Antonio lowered his hand and ran it through the dog's soft fur, feeling the comforting warmth beneath his fingers. Nick was lying next to her, as always, in her constant, silent presence. The elderly man knew that that dog was not just a companion. It was an angel without wings, a guardian who appeared when he needed it most. And more than anything, Nick needed to keep doing what he was born to do. I want him to have a purpose, replied Antonio, his voice choked but determined. He gave me everything. I want him to be able to do the same for someone else. Nick looked up at Antonio at that moment, and the elderly man felt something inexplicable. He knew. Somehow, that dog seemed to understand every word said. There was something about the way Nick moved, the way his body remained still, attentive, as if he was waiting for the right moment to move forward. Antonio smiled, despite the tight pain in his chest. He slowly ran his fingers over Nick's ears, feeling the dog's calm breathing. You always knew what to do, didn't you, boy? The silence that followed was not one of sadness, but of acceptance. Time would take its course, but Nick's legacy would continue. He not only guided Anthony through the darkness, he would now guide someone into the light. And this, Antonio realized, was the greatest proof of love that could exist. Time never asks for permission to move forward. He moves forward, without looking back, carrying with him everything we were, everything we lived, and everything we still want to live. Antonio always knew this, but now he felt the weight of this truth more than ever. He had found in Nick something he never imagined he would have again, a reason to keep going. But deep down I knew I couldn't be by his side forever, and that was the only thing that worried him. The dog that showed up at his door one cold night saved him in so many ways. He not only gave her back the courage to leave the house, to walk, to feel the wind and sun on her skin again. Nick gave him his life back, but now Antonio knew he needed to think about his friend's future. What would happen when he was no longer there? Where would Nick go? Who would take care of him? The idea of leaving him alone, without a purpose, without someone who needed him as much as Antonio did, was unbearable. Nick was a special dog. He did not belong to a meaningless life. He had a greater mission, something that went beyond simply being a companion. Antonio knew this, and so he made the decision that would change everything. That afternoon, with his voice choked but firm, Antonio made a call to the Guide Dog Center. The woman on the other end answered with a welcoming tone. "Guide Dog Training Center, good afternoon." Antonio took a deep breath, trying to contain the emotion that insisted on rising to his throat. "My name is Antonio. We've been talking for some time about my dog, about Nick." There was a brief pause before the woman responded. "Yes, I remember. How are you?" He ran his hand over Nick's soft fur, who rested beside him calmly, having no idea of the decision that was about to be made. "We are fine. Actually, I need to talk to you about something important." The woman remained silent for a few moments, waiting for him to continue. Antonio took a deep breath before saying the words he had been carrying with him for days. "I want Nick to have a purpose, even when I can't be here anymore." On the other end of the line, the woman seemed to hold her breath for a moment. When he responded, his voice was gentle, but full of respect for the weight of that decision. "Do you want him to become a guide dog?" Antonio nodded slowly, as if the answer had been clear to him for a long time. "I want him to continue helping other blind people, the same way he helped me." There was a pause. Antonio imagined that the woman was choosing her words carefully, understanding the depth of that request. "Mr. Antonio, that is one of the most beautiful gestures I have ever heard. Nick has a natural talent for this. He has a rare instinct. If you really want this, we can help you follow that path." Antonio passed his hand over Nick once again, feeling his heart beat calmly under the warm touch of his fur. The dog was always by his side. He always knew exactly what to do. He never needed training to understand what his owner needed. And now, Antonio knew that this gift couldn't get lost. "That's what I want," he confirmed, his voice low but full of conviction. Nick looked up at him, as if he knew something important was happening, as if he somehow understood that his journey was about to change. The dog that was once abandoned in the cold found a home, found a mission, found a man who needed him. Now, he would have the chance to continue changing lives exactly as he changed Antonio's, and that would be his greatest mission. Farewell is always the most difficult moment. Antonio knew this day would come, but nothing could prepare him for the silent pain that spread inside him, making every moment with Nick more precious and, at the same time, more painful. The dog, who had always been his guide, his company and his foundation, was now restless. He felt it. From the moment Antonio woke up that morning, something was different. His body, which for so long had been just a weight he carried patiently, now seemed to demand more of him than ever. His arms were weak, his legs hesitated before obeying, and even breathing seemed a tiring task. It wasn't pain, it wasn't discomfort. It was simply time asking for your account. And he knew it. The world, which he hadn't seen in years, seemed even more distant. The sound of birds outside sounded muffled, as if coming from somewhere far beyond where he could reach. The wind that came through the window no longer brought the same freshness, and the light that warmed her skin seemed paler, more diffuse, as if it were saying goodbye. But amidst all this, there was only one certainty. Nick was there. The dog didn't leave his side for even a second, always attentive, always observing, as if he knew that day wasn't like the others. Antonio felt his steady breathing beside him, the slight movement of his chest rising and falling, the discreet sound of his nails touching the floor when he changed position. But unlike other days, Nick didn't seem relaxed. His body was tense, his eyes fixed on the elderly man, as if he were trying to read what Antonio still didn't have the courage to say. With effort, he stood up and walked slowly to the armchair that had so often been his refuge. As soon as he got comfortable, feeling the familiar old upholstery beneath his tired body, Nick immediately came over and lay down at his feet. But this time, he didn't close his eyes. He didn't rest. He just remained there, with his head resting on his paws, waiting. The silence between them was deep, but not empty. It was a silence filled with everything that didn't need to be said. Antonio lowered his trembling hand and ran it through Nick's fur, feeling each soft strand under his fingers. He wanted to memorize that feeling. He wanted to engrave in his mind the warm, comforting texture that so often calmed him, because for the first time, he felt that perhaps there wouldn't be many other mornings like this. Nick took a deep breath and let out a long, almost heavy sigh. Antonio felt the subtle vibration of the dog's body against his feet, a low sound but full of emotion, as if Nick was somehow feeling what he felt. "You know, don't you, boy?" Antonio murmured, his voice choked, almost in a whisper. Nick didn't move, but his ears perked up slightly, as if he were waiting to hear more. The elderly man smiled, but it was a weak smile, a smile of someone who understands that certain moments can't be avoided. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me." He wanted to say so many things. "I wanted to thank you for every day that Nick was by your side, for each walk, for each time you guided him with patience, for every morning the dog woke up before him, sitting by his side, waiting silently, as if he knew his presence was what kept Antonio strong. He wanted to say that I couldn't have asked for a better friend, but most of all, I wanted Nick to know that I wouldn't be alone." But before he could say anything, he felt a hot tear escape and slide down his wrinkled skin, falling gently onto Nick's nose. The dog raised its head, and Antonio felt the cold touch of its nose pressing against his hand, a simple gesture, but one that Saeed more than any words could say. Nick was there, as it always has been, as it always would be, and that was exactly what made that goodbye so difficult. Nick was always there. From the moment he appeared on that cold night, huddled and trembling at Antonio's door, until that very moment, he never left him alone. He was there when no one else was. When the house was just an empty shelter, when the silence seemed deafening. Nick was there on good days, on bad days, on days when Antonio felt that time was slipping through his hands. He was always there. But now Antonio knew he needed to let him go, not because I wanted to, not because it was easy, but why it was right. The elderly man's heart felt heavy like never before. Each beat seemed to echo in his very soul, like a cruel reminder that life always moves on, even when we're not ready for it. He wanted to believe he would have more time, more walks with Nick, more mornings where the dog would curl up next to him, more moments of shared silence where one understood the other without a single word being spoken. But he knew better. And Nick knew it too. The dog noticed Antonio's hesitation. He always noticed. He always knew how to read every gesture, every change in his owner's breathing, every small variation in his voice that indicated an unspoken thought. But this time he didn't understand, because Antonio was sad, but it wasn't a temporary sadness, the kind that Nick chased away just by touching his nose to his hand. It was something bigger, something definitive. Nick stood up slowly, cautiously, as if he felt that this moment required delicacy. With slow steps, he approached and placed his head on the elderly man's lap. He stayed there, motionless, just seeking his touch, trying to understand. What was happening? Why did everything seem different? Why, deep in your loyal heart, did he feel something was wrong? Antonio closed his eyes for a moment. Trembling hands slid over the dog's face, feeling the soft texture of the fur that had so often comforted him. Every thread, every breath, every beat of Nick's heart was a reminder of everything they had lived together, and how it hurt to know that soon he would no longer be there to feel them. "You're special, Nick," Antonio whispered, his voice breaking, almost breaking. The dog sighed, his warm breath hitting the elderly man's fingers. "And I need you to continue being special to someone who needs you." Nick remained motionless. He didn't understand words, but understood feelings. And in that instant he realized something was changing. There was a weight in Antonio's voice, something different, something Nick had never heard before. And as much as he wanted to, he didn't know what to do to get rid of that feeling. The time they spent together was always absolute. Trust? Nick always knew exactly what to do to help. But now, for the first time, he didn't know how to stop what was happening, because deep down, he didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave him alone. But something in Nick's heart said that this time, he would have no choice. Endings are not always the end. Sometimes they are just the beginning of a new story. Nick missed Antonio. He didn't completely understand why his owner wasn't there anymore, why the silent house they shared was. Behind him, all he knew was that somehow things had changed. But even without understanding all the reasons, Nick trusted. Antonio always knew what was best. He always knew how to guide him, just as he himself guided the elderly man. And now, he was in a new place, surrounded by unfamiliar people, smelling new smells, hearing new voices. The guide dog training center was not like his old home. There were no Antonio's slow, careful steps down the corridor, nor the low, gentle voice that always called him by name. But there was something there that Nick recognized. There was purpose. In the first few weeks, the coaches were surprised by him. It was as if Nick already knew everything. He didn't need to be taught to stop before an obstacle, to avoid potholes, to walk confidently alongside someone who couldn't see. All of this was already in him. What other dogs learned from months of training, Nick did it naturally, because he had done it before. He learned from Antonio, and deep down, he knew that everything he lived with his first owner prepared him for that moment. It was then that a few weeks after his arrival, Nick was introduced to someone who would change his destiny once again. The smell was new, the voice soft and hesitant. It was a young woman named Laura. She had recently lost her vision. She still didn't completely accept her new reality. She still felt afraid of going out alone. She still carried within herself the pain of a world she previously knew and which suddenly had turned into darkness. But Nick knew exactly what to do. The first time Laura held her leash, her hands were shaking. She didn't trust herself. She didn't trust that she could walk without seeing. She didn't trust that she could move on. But when Nick took the first step, pulling her lightly, guiding her with the confidence that only he had, something inside her changed. It was as if, for the first time since everything happened, someone said she wasn't alone. The first few days were of adaptation. Laura hesitated to trust, hesitated to believe that she could walk without fear. But Nick didn't hesitate. He just did it. He stopped when necessary, avoided obstacles, guided Laura forward with the certainty of someone who had done it before. And then, after days of training, something happened. One morning, when Laura woke up and held Nick's leash for the first time, she didn't hesitate. She felt the light pressure of the collar and simply trusted. And it was at that moment that he understood. Nick wasn't just a dog. He was the bridge between fear and courage. He was the light in the middle of the darkness. And at that moment, Laura knew that, even without seeing it, she could continue. Because Nick was there. Because Nick, I would always know the way. Memories never completely disappear. They live in small gestures, in silent moments, in habits that become part of who we are. For Nick, life had changed irreversibly. He was no longer in the simple house, where he spent his afternoons lying at Antonio's feet, listening to his calm voice tell stories about times that he couldn't see, but that he felt in every word. There was no longer that familiar smell of coffee being prepared in the morning, nor the sound of trembling hands sliding over the upholstery of the armchair before stroking its fur. But somehow, Antonio was still there. Nick now lived next door to Laura, his new owner. The days were different, the paths they took were different, but their purpose remained the same. He guided her just as he guided Antonio. He stopped when he needed to, adjusted his steps to make her feel safe, moved with the same patience and care he learned alongside his first owner. But despite everything, there was something inside him that never changed. Nick never forgot Antonio. And Laura, even without knowing the whole story of that extraordinary dog, understood this. There was a point in the day when Nick seemed different. Every night, when the house fell into silence, when Laura had retired to sleep, he walked to the window. The movement was always the same. He would sit, raise his head, and look at the sky. Sometimes he just stood there, quiet, as if he was waiting for something. Other times, he would let out a small whine, a low sound, almost a whisper. At first, Laura didn't understand. Whenever night fell and the house fell into silence, Nick would get up from his corner and slowly walk to the window. He sat there, motionless, his head high, his eyes fixed on the sky as if searching for something only he could see. At first, she thought it was just a habit, perhaps an instinct left over from her previous life. But over time, he realized that there was something more. "What are you looking at, boy?" she asked, her voice soft as she ran her hand through Nick's warm fur. He never responded, never looked away, never changed his posture. He just remained there, attentive, breathing slowly, as if he was waiting for something, as if he was trying to feel something that no one else could perceive. And deep down he was. Because for Nick, Antonio was never just an owner. He was your first mission. The reason he discovered he was more than a dog abandoned on the street, more than a survivor of an uncertain past. Antonio gave him a purpose, a home, a meaning for every step he took. And now, even though their paths had parted, Nick I was still looking for him. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe it was something deeper, something no one could ever explain. But somehow he still felt Antonio's presence, like a memory that doesn't fade, like an echo that continues even when the voice is gone. Time passed, but the habit remained. At first, Laura tried to call him back. He patted the mattress, beckoning him to lie down next to him, but Nick never moved until he was ready. It was only after a few nights that she realized that that moment was bigger than her, greater than any explanation she could give herself. So she stopped calling him and simply stayed by his side, sitting on the floor, looking at the sky even without knowing what he saw. But Nick knew, because certain connections never die. And every night, as he looked up at the stars, he knew that someone somewhere was still looking out for him too. Some stories don't end. They continue to echo, living in the memories of those who were touched by them, remaining alive even when their protagonists are no longer here. The story of Antonio and Nick was one of those, the kind of story that is not lost over time, because it doesn't just belong to those who lived it, but to everyone who heard it. It all started with an unlikely meeting, a chance that could have gone unnoticed. A dog without direction, without a home, without anyone. A man who had already accepted that his life would be just a succession of lonely days, surrounded by silence and darkness. Neither of them imagined that their lives were about to change. Neither of them knew that at that moment would become each other's salvation. Nick was no ordinary dog. He was never just a companion. He was never just an animal that appeared by chance. From the first moment, he knew exactly what to do. When Antonio needed strength, he was at his feet. When you needed direction, he was your eyes. When you needed courage, he was your heart. And Antonio wasn't just a lonely old man either. He was the first to look at Nick and see beyond the dirty, skinny street dog. He was the one who gave Nick a home, a purpose, a chance to be something greater. Therefore, in the end, they both saved each other. Their story began to spread naturally, first among the neighbors, then through the streets that Antonio had previously feared walking. The man who for years was invisible to the world was now remembered with affection and respect. Everyone talked about him and the dog that never left him, about how an animal that was rejected by life found a way to give hope. Back to someone who had already given up hope, but it didn't stop there. The Guide Dog Training Center told Nick's story to others who also needed a friend like him. Some of them, who had never considered the possibility of a guide dog, began to think differently. They wanted to know more. They wanted to believe that maybe the darkness could be filled by something greater than the absence of light. And so, without either of them knowing, Antonio and Nick changed lives. But the story didn't just stop with reports. On a small bulletin board in the training center, a photo was placed. Antonio sitting in his old armchair, smiling with his hand resting on Nick. And next to the image, a single sentence. Sometimes the greatest light in the dark comes from where we least expect it. Nick followed his journey. Laura was now his owner, but he never forgot Antonio. And somehow, everyone who knew his story did too never forgot. Because certain stories are eternal. And this, without a doubt, would be remembered forever. Stories like Nick and Antonio's make us see that often salvation comes from where we least expect it. If this journey has touched you in some way, imagine how many other people might feel the same way. Now, you have the chance to take that message even further. Leave your like so that more people know this story, and comment "unexpected heroes" in the comments to show that Nick and Antonio will never be forgotten. And the most incredible thing, the next video is now on screen and brings an even more exciting story. If this one makes your heart skip a beat, wait until you see what comes next. Click now and continue this journey.